My guest today is jazz pianist Jon Raney. He's the son of jazz guitar great Jimmy Raney. I am very excited to talk about his father and his family's wonderful contributions to jazz history, pedagogy. Jon, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Hey, Nikhil. How you doing?
Doing great. And so I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you. Your father was not a guitarist that I was aware of for the longest time, and I had no idea that he was so good. And I'm talking about right at the top good. Now, normally, because when I started learning about, I actually was a jazz guitarist when I went to Berkeley, and I learned about Tal Farlow, Joe Pass, of course, Wes Montgomery is a name, Charlie Christian, later George Benson, but I hadn't heard at all about Jimmy Raney. And fast forward a decade or so later, I really get interested in Barry Harris, and there was this very interesting anecdote, because I was really following Barry Harris, that he had a concert in Tokyo in 1976. Basically, I had known Barry Harris to not really give compliments unless he really meant it, like he really admired someone. And he said, that Jimmy Raney, he sounds just like Bird. I said, whoa, what? Now that's like, word of mouth is the best kind of endorsement, right? So, and I said, who is this Jimmy Raney? And of course, once I started listening, I was completely blown away. And so it's really a thrill to talk to you, Jon. And so let's start from, I wonder where we can start. So talk about,
if you like, that's probably a good starting
point. Let's start with that.
So that was the Live in Tokyo concert. And that was basically three groups with the same core rhythm section. So it was Charles McPherson, my dad, and Barry Harris, and they were all using Leroy Williams and Sam Jones as the rhythm section. So it was three separate concerts. I believe it was over 2 days. And so they did their own records, really. And then the final night, they all played together. And that was, so each of them was released on its own recording. So obviously they became very familiar with each other's playing because they were listening to each other as the concert was going on, and then finally they were playing with each other. So Barry, of course, probably knew my dad's playing pretty well, and the producer of the record was Don Schlitten. Now, Don Schlitten, in particular, really almost like his mission was to get Jimmy Raney more recognition.
Right.
So your experience with him, like, wow, like, who's Jimmy Raney? I never heard of him. Why haven't I heard of him? Well, I mean, Don Schlitten felt the same way. So he wanted to, show the world what a talent everybody was missing. And then in my own way, I've sort of kind of continued that mission in a way, saying, well, wait a second. Wes is great and Jim Hall is great, but what about Jimmy Raney?
I want to plug your really excellent YouTube channel, and there are so many wonderful clips. I think that's another point we can talk about. There's a clip of your father actually talking about not only hanging out with Charlie Parker, but sitting in a home, listening to Bartók. And I was thinking, wait a second. Charlie Parker is this kind of mythical figure. And if you hear about Barry talking about Charlie Parker, he maybe sat in with him once and then that was it. Or if I talked to Charles McPherson, he said, I met him once and I when I was 15 and that was it. Now, your father had a much closer relationship.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, my father was kind of he got into it very early, so therefore he was in the scene more when it was happening. Like I think he's maybe roughly the same age as Barry, maybe a year or two older perhaps. But he got into music very early and went straight to where it was happening by 1945, which is where, so he, he went to Chicago when he was about 17 and he woodshed there. I think he wanted to stay out of the spotlight just a little bit, but still be around players that were involved in the scene in Chicago, like Stitt and Lou Donaldson, people like that. But then he went to New York. He joined the fairly well-known group at the time called the Jerry Wald Orchestra. And so he met in that band, I believe, was Al Haig. And Al Haig, of course, was playing with Parker, right? So it was kind of like Al said, "Hey, you need to check out these records," and he sort of took them under his wing, and from there, Dad returned to the scene really early on, like the late 40s or so. And he said, yeah, he sat in with Parker. He said his fingers were shaking when he was doing it, but Parker was really nice to him. Said, yeah, sounds great. And over time, they developed. Parker would do that. He'd develop some friends and he'd hang out. And these were like young guys and they were idolizing him. And so he'd knock on the door and say, hey, got any gin? And, I mean, these kinds of things are, I also believe he had dinner with my dad and my mom down in Sheridan Square as how I recall. So sure, he definitely, he idolized the man, but he actually knew him.
Had a friendship, yeah. And growing up, I mean, your father, I mean, such a genius. Did he ever relate any personal anecdotes to you about Charlie Parker? Are there any interesting things that other than the listening to Bartók, which I thought was really quite astonishing? I mean, because that shows another depth to Charlie Parker and your dad listening to music that has nothing to do with like the swing time era or anything.
He not too many stories beyond the getting together and the sitting in story where he said his hands were shaking on the bandstand. I don't recall any others. He probably did. I think he probably maybe sat in with him on a few other occasions and acquitted himself a little bit. You know how that is. You go to the jam sessions maybe were really prevalent in those days, and you could, you could gain access to good players by jamming with them. I think that's probably the case with him.
Did your father know Bud Powell?
He knew him, but at the time, I think Bud was going through some difficulties by the time he got to know him. You know what I mean? Mental difficulties. He was beaten, as I recall.
And he was committed, I think, at the Creedmoor.
Yeah, somebody beat him up, and he never was the same after that. I believe that it made him a little bit leery of him because he never knew what to expect. He met him, I believe, but he definitely had issues after the beating, I think. So I think he steered clear of him.
On the historical record, I mean, Charlie Parker himself, there's not much about him actually speaking about music. Did your father and Charlie Parker ever talk about like music, how to improvise or anything like that? Or did your father ask him like, hey, what are you doing? How are you thinking? That sort of thing?
No, I don't think that happened other than, the personal get-togethers and talking about music in general, because I think them talking about Bartók in particular and sharing things outside of jazz were really important it was a common thing to both of them. They were trying to explore other realms besides just the scene in itself, like the background, like these other influences, Bartók and Stravinsky. Obviously, I mean, Stravinsky, Parker listened to Stravinsky too. And the Firebird Suite, I think there's things that he actually lifted material from there. So I think they shared that bond of things that were outside of music, which makes sense, right? Because you're socializing and the personalities are coming together on the things that you bring to the music, right? And so I think that's something that Dad, he was restless, he really wanted to address as many different things. He was really steeped into the movement of bebop when it was really happening, which is kind of, I think in some ways he's talked about being lucky that way, being involved when it was really a movement. It was an excitement at that point. But then there was also what bebop was informed by, what made it so much radically different than what was going on prior to that.
There's an incredible video of your father teaching at a workshop. And the question is about scales and improvisation and all those things. And now I'd love to get, how did your father and you and your family, how do you think, for instance, when I went to Berkeley, we had a system. There was chord scales, there was modes, And then Barry Harris has his dominant scales. David Baker has a bebop scale. Now, in what terms did, for instance, your father think about these fundamentals? I mean, did he think in terms of chord symbols, maybe Roman numerals, numbers, scale degrees? How did he conceptualize things?
Well, not to be the point of view that he was taking, I think in the video, I believe that you're quoting, he didn't really think of scales. He knew them, but there was a sense of not consciously applying them. Like, in other words, his Stan Getz example was pretty much, he was playing the scales because he heard them. So the driving force there was the ideas that happened to contain the scales, was his perspective. So, of course, you have to physically be able to play the scales, right? So you have to know the scales. And he even said, he had a classical teacher that had him playing scales in a regimented way to have his fingers available in those general positions and those general appraisals of how to get an up and down on from F to F, how to get up and down on a minor scale, etc. But then when it came down to actually applying that to approaches to jazz and to bebop, it was really about transcribing, sitting down with the records and transcribing them and trying to be them on your own instrument is what he was getting at.
Let's say there's somebody who really transcribes a lot of solos, but how do you then take that completes? Because we see this in classical music. You can take a kid, he might learn the Beethoven piano sonatas, a couple of them, but he still won't know how to improvise. He might be able to play a full sonata, but it doesn't necessarily mean he'll know how to break it up. So for instance, if your father or, if you guys had a new song you had to learn for a gig and you saw a bunch of chords, are you guys thinking about landing on certain notes, on strong beats and that sort of thing?
I don't think you're thinking about it, because the more you think about it, the more it eludes you. So I would have to say that there's two distinct things. Practicing is practicing and playing is playing, right? So when you're practicing, you're thinking about the difficult things, right? Like, you don't have to really go over things that are very straightforward. You go straight to the parts that, this is a difficult change right here. How do I get through that? And how do I connect this change to let's say, the bridge? Or, there's something where there's an unusual harmony that you have to make sound natural, right? So I believe that it's really governed by the ear. Well, again, you would shed the things that are bothering you and that are difficult, and then you try to come up with a representative idea based on the study that you're making, something that's musical, that reflects you having studied. And then when you play, you just try to respond to it, because in my view, improvising is really about responding to something you lay out there in musical space and reply with another idea. It's like a split-second thing. It's like an internal dialogue with yourself, that you're responding to something that you conceive of with something else that you can think of in the moment as you play it. And it becomes like a feedback loop, I believe. And so I really think that that's what he does. He definitely works on things on the side, but then he tries to forget about them. Once he's applied it, it has to become automatic. It has to get into your fingers. You have to almost be able to do these things without even thinking about it, because there's a limited amount of time that happens when you're improvising, that it's microseconds, really, isn't it? The tune is going by, and you need to accurately transcribe what your next thought is and stay ahead of the music. So with that in mind, you have to have a lot in your fingers that are just basically automatic. So like you could almost be watching television as you're trying to execute the idea.
Did your father think in terms of chord symbols? Because I remember Joe Pass, I saw an interview with him, and he doesn't think in terms of modes. He doesn't think in terms of ones or twos or fives. He doesn't think but he did say, I learned guitar with symbols, C, F, G. So did your father also, did he say like this is an F major 7? Was that something he would have said? Or a A7 sharp 11? Did he talk in those sort of terms?
He knew his chords, absolutely. I mean, he was, he studied composition, right? He studied composition.
Oh, he did? Tell me about that.
Yeah, he studied legit writing with Hall Overton. Hall Overton was kind of the jazz. He was the link between jazz players and classical music. He was a composer, a Juilliard-trained composer. I thought perhaps you knew that part.
No. He was I'm learning something, yeah.
Thelonious Monk's music and the famous, I think it was a nonet from the late 50s at the Jazz. There's a whole, if you can look it up, just look up the Jazz Loft. And there's a story about Hall Overton and Thelonious Monk. That's who my father studied with, was Hall Overton. He studied with him privately.
And for how long?
I don't really know. It was definitely a concerted study for a few years. My father learned to play cello, actually, because he was writing for a string quartet.
And did he talk about that training? How did that influence it?
Well, I mean, he was very influenced by Bartók, especially probably opening up a new door for you here. Sounds like there's an album called Strings and Swings. Well, the A side is a concert he did in Louisville from 1967. And it's just amazing. But on the flip side of it was a recording that never made it out that was released by Muse Records. It's from 1957. It's called Suite for Guitar Quintet. And that was heavily influenced. I mean, it's a merging of classical music with jazz music. So he wrote, his original intention was to write a string quartet, but he didn't quite make it. So he ended up like doing the Suite for Guitar Quintet, where he is the fifth instrument and he's improvising over these themes he wrote. And they're very classically influenced. In particular, Bartók's fifth string quartet is an influence. So, yeah, so you'll have to check that out, and then you really understand what he's talking about when he says he's influenced by Bartók.
So did he study counterpoint and classical harmony in that way?
Yeah, okay. Studied. I don't know the details of those lessons with Hall Overton, but that was certainly part of it. He had to learn how to write for instruments. He had a really bold ambition.
How does someone, and just if you could give some advice, what's a good way to get started into doing some, not saying playing some incredible solos, but just, getting it basic and starting off in the right foot? And we're talking bebop.
Yeah. Well, I guess my father belongs to the brand of musicians. How can I put this? I guess there's different methodologies. Some people, I believe, have a methodology where they kind of bring the students to their methodology. And they have a certain way of teaching things, and everybody kind of gets the same prescription in a way. My father, I believe he got into teaching later after he had a career. I would say the majority of his teaching came from the late 70s onward, I would say. And before that, it was more, he would give private lessons to guitarists, but it was more about, when you're a really accomplished musician, you have to be very sensitive to what people are playing. You have to identify what's really good about their playing and what's really bad about their playing, and you reflect upon yourself that way. And so that's kind of his approach. Someone would come in and play and say, well, just play for me. And he would say, well, maybe your timing went off a little bit here, or maybe you're doing things too Einschweizerei, like little boxcars. You should try to play more asymmetrically. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. So what he did was he listened and then reflected and said, why don't you do a little bit more of this? And then they would kind of work from there. So it was really about where the student was at is the way he approached it. It wasn't so much. I mean, the elements were important, and as a teacher, you have to have your scales down, you have to know your harmony, you have to know your rhythm, you have to be able to read someone, I would think. And people, so you have to be prepared to answer questions, but you have to be able to listen to somebody and see what it is they're lacking, because you've done so in yourself. You've looked at yourself and said, well, I'm doing this, I can't stand that, let me get that out of my playing. So they take that same self-awareness and they apply it to the student that's in front of them.
What would he do if he wanted to practice? What was the sort of thing that he would practice?
Well, aside from the initial practicing he did, which I think it's true, is the transcribing in the beginning, where when you're transcribing somebody, you're actually looking at the materials as well. Because in the assimilation, it's not just playing along with them. He actually reflected on the materials themselves, like, how can I take this piece and use it in myself, in my own way? Like, take a statement that somebody makes, like a particular phrase, and then take that phrase and try it over this tune or this change, or maybe play it in a different place than is normally expected. He actually dissected the language in addition to transcribing the language. So I believe that process is inevitable when you transcribe and you really learn what people are doing. You take it apart for yourself. Later on, like, I want to say in like the 70s and so on, he started getting into practicing specifically scales in 6s and 3s and 8s and 5s, different combinations of things, and taking certain phrases and seeing how they sounded transposed to another beat, for example, and getting comfortable with how, not only just to be able to do it, but what it sounded like. You know what I mean? Like, when you take an idea and move it over slightly, it sounds a little bit like a different idea. You know what I mean? So he got used to it, like taking a phrase that was on 1 and then moving it over to the end of 1 or the 2 or the 3, but also letting it percolate as well, like being able to hear the idea. So I think that that's an advantage, because when you're in a real-time playing situation, the thought comes to you and you want to hear it. You don't want to think it, right? So it's a combination of actually breaking down. It's like, well, what does this sound like? What if I did this? What does it sound like? And then putting it through the cauldron of speculation and then listening back and then getting it so where you hear it that way. I think that was one of the methodologies he used, like saying, what if I did this? What does it sound like? And then trying it out and then learning to hear it. And then that's something that you actually own in a real way, like when you're responding to the musical moment.
Let me ask a very basic question. So the question is, if he had D minor 7, G7, and then C. Now, I've heard from Barry, for instance, he says there's no 2, so just play a G7 scale. I've heard there's another teacher who says, don't think of the 5, just think of the 2. And then there are other people who think, no, you got to think of both chords. And some people say, no, that's the Dorian, that's the Mixolydian. And I'm sure you've heard all of this. So right. How would your dad have thought of something like that?
Well, I don't think people get almost quasi jazz religious about what you should do and what you should think about something. I try to stay out of that. I mean, he does deal with them as changes. He plays them. They're clearly outlined as changes. Now, I think Barry's methodology really, I think generally Barry probably happened upon his methodology by actually taking apart what he already learned by ear, even though he may talk about it in a technical way now. I think he really took himself apart and decided, well, what is it that I'm really doing? Oh, well, when I play a Mixolydian scale, I'm always adding the major 7th, and here's Parker, he did this, and here's Coltrane, da da ba da ba da ba da. like everybody plays that, right? Ba 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 da ba do be up and data, like that kind of thing. Like when you hear it in language, suddenly you get a confirmation of, oh, well, yeah, that's the Mixolydian scale, but it's not really, it's this other thing. So over time, it develops its own codification and identification. Like, I guess that's the Bebop Mixolydian scale. And also some of his theories about when you add a chromatic note. But I think it's driven, the theories are behind the actual music. So however you think of it is however you think of it. If you see chords, there's nothing wrong with chords. I mean, because this is a visual, it's kind of a crutch in a way. It's a way to identify that which happens sonically. It's a graphic representation. And so choosing one graphic representation over another is a matter of choice,
When were his formative years of getting his playing together?
Well, I would say that would be from 1940. Well, formative years would be from 1944 to like maybe 1947, maybe. And by 48, he was working in well-known bands, I would say, and recording. He got into it early and became a professional early. So as far as his jazz experience, I mean, I believe I recounted in the biography, he started guitar at 10. He worked with a classical teacher who taught him, scales and positions and things like that, the general technique of the instrument. And then he went to Hayden Causey, who introduced him to Charlie Christian, who blew him away. And then he started listening to the old records, So I'm sure at some point he was listening to Charlie Christian records and trying to play along with them because he played some Charlie Christian licks. And he listened to Lester Young, and then he went to New York and he heard Charlie Parker, and then he met Al Haig, who said, "Here, transcribe all of the Savoy recordings." So I still have those records. So he went and actually learned all the solos, learned all the Bud Powell solos, learned all the Charlie Parker solos, and so he was practicing constantly. In fact, people comment, when he was on the bus, like traveling with Woody Herman. It's like, man, do you ever stop practicing? And he's just practicing. And it's listening and then trying stuff out and then working on a scale. If you're having a difficulty, it's like everything and above. It's everything in the kitchen sink, because ultimately when you're performing, you have to do everything at once. All right. You have to get familiar with the material. You got to work on your stuff. You got to work on your technique. You got to work out your ideas. You have to keep there's nothing like having to perform that puts the fear of God in you. Like, geez, I got to get this together. And you're kind of doing it all at once. It's very unique. And I believe that's what he was doing. And then over time, as he made more records, he was still working on music, but then he started studying and incorporating different things, like the things that I was suggesting, like studying actually how to write for strings, how to, listening to different music, listening to things that were more dissonant, more challenging, and trying to incorporate those things into his playing. So that's his track.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the Savoy records. Are those the main ones, basically? So the Charlie Parker, the Bud Powell.
Those are the main ones. He learned how to play those note for note. The Charlie Parker and the Bud Powell solos.
Just in terms of quantity, how many solos is that?
Don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's probably something you can count. I've never counted how many. Those 30. Not the 10-inch records, they usually had maybe 3 songs on a side or something, and they tried to make them short, so it's maybe 4 cuts on each side. So there's probably on an average of 6 to 8 tunes on each record. So I think he had 3 records, so do the math. And Bud Powell wasn't playing on all of those records. It was Argon Thornton. His name is, I guess, Sadiq Hakim, right? So he played on some of that. And Miles played on some of that, and Dizzy played on other things because Miles was kind of flipped out at some of the tunes that were on the record. So Diz ended up playing trumpet. So it was a mixture of those players.
Did your father meet or was influenced by Art Tatum in any way?
He saw Art Tatum play. He certainly, I don't think he was influenced by him because there's just, Art Tatum was a world unto himself. And he's so many, he's not technically a line player. My father was attracted to people who played lines.
How did your father develop from his playing in the the late 40s? And how did that change 20 years later? Is there a change in his development there, and what was noticeably different?
I think there was if I want to say, the period like in the 50s, there was a certain amount of more delicate, perhaps, approach. Maybe it was somewhat influenced by the guitar he was using. He had a certain amount of space that he used, right, when he played early on. It was he really was, I think he was, in a way, used more space than other players did. I think a lot of players were busier trying to make things happen. And he would leave a lot more spaces and play much more delicately and less exaggerated, which is not to say later on he played less, exaggerated. But I think there were more concepts at play. He played a little bit more aggressively. His sound, there was an increase in the kinds of materials that he would bring into his playing over time. Like, by the 60s, like that album, Strings and Swings that I wanted to mention, he's doing things where he's going from the bottom of the guitar to the top of the guitar. Boom, 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 boom. And I really think that's those ideas were directly influenced by his cello playing. I mentioned that in my last blog. I don't know if you read it, but some of the ideas that he was doing were very particular to him. He developed certain signature ideas that were entirely his own, in my opinion. And his way of playing certain phrases like ba-ba-doo-be-ah, ba-doo-ba-doo-be-ah, ba-doo-ba-doo-be-ah, ba-doo-ba-doo-be-ah. Those are definitely like things that he studied and worked on his own. Like he had a lot of that kind of thing. Or so you can see like the rhythm and the ideas there as well. Because it's like there's definitely this undercurrent of three in his playing that just comes out in different ways, and he learns how to. When you play that way, instantly you start thinking in larger metrical spaces, because you introduce that polyrhythmic tension, and so I think that he brought more of that kind of thing, more of that polyrhythmic tension, more of those groupings, more things introduced from disparate places like Bartók and things like that.
Would you say that bebop, that polyrhythmic sense, is really an identifiable characteristic of bebop, and your father and Charlie Parker, and they get that from the beginning? And I guess some people, I think that that when a lot of people who teach bebop, I don't really, I don't even know if that's really even mentioned at all.
Right.
And I think now the way you describe it, that's kind of a core element, actually. I mean, at least if you want to approximate Charlie Parker.
Right. Well, that's an important point you raise. It's certainly in my father's case, that is a characteristic of the characteristic detail of the music that he noticed in particular, that he really took to heart. And it might be something that's often missed.
Because a lot of people it's just running eighth notes.
Exactly. Yeah. You can become seduced to the sound of Charlie Parker or the sound of these players, and maybe identifying these phrases, but you're a little bit too micro-focused on the small stuff and not on the bigger picture. And I think my father was a big picture person, like thinking about large stretches of measures, like to the point where you go from a cell and expanding upon that cell, and then how that builds. Like a perfect example would be, let's say like a blues phrase, right? How like you tell one idea becomes like a one measure idea, becomes a two measure, becomes a four measure idea, etc. Like ba da 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 ba do da 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 do da 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 da, right? I mean, you can hear the first part is da 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 da, and then the second part it do da 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 is on the four chord. And then the whole thing, the last idea takes the two elements and ties them together. So now you have a formula for building a cell, answering it with another cell, and then in hindsight, you hear the whole idea as an entire unit. And then when you're in bar 5, you suddenly hear what you just did, which is an entire unit. And that, with that idea, you're able to then think in larger framework, and you're doing it and hearing it at the same time. But the essential thing is that it's not just that one idea in bar 1. It's what you did with the one idea, how you manipulated that idea. In this case, this may be not so rhythmic, but it is, in a sense, polymetric, because you're thinking over a larger space. And so, but he went beyond just development schemes. He believed very much in asymmetry as the feature, and in particular asymmetry, the feature in bebop. What made Charlie so fascinating was the asymmetry he was using, like, and how he almost sounded like I had this experience once. I had Charlie Parker playing in the other room, and I couldn't hear the rhythm section. And when I was listening back to it, I couldn't tell what the tempo of the tune was. I didn't know if he was playing a ballad. I didn't know if he was playing an up-tempo tune or a medium-tempo tune, because for him, he had reduced the entire structure of the music so that it didn't matter what tempo he was at. He was applying the same principles across whatever time he was in. And I think that Barry understands those kinds of things too, but he talks about them in different ways.
Can I get you to react to this Charlie Parker quote, which is interesting because this quote is interpreted by different teachers in different ways. So I want to see what you think about this. He was talking, one of the few things that he talked about his method, and it was this. He said, now I'd been getting bored with the stereotype changes that were being used all the time, at the time, and I kept thinking there's bound to be something else. I could hear it sometimes, but I couldn't play it. Well, that night I was working over Cherokee, and as I did, I found out that by using the higher intervals of a chord as a melody line, and backing them with the appropriately related changes, I could play the thing I'd been hearing. I came alive. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think he's talking about the upper extensions and them having a logic of their own. Like in particular, like if you're playing a minor seventh, then it's easy to extend that up. Like if you're playing a C minor seventh, then an E flat major seventh or an E flat major 9 has the same validity there. But it's almost like you don't necessarily, in order to understand the C minor seventh, you can remove the C in your concept and deal with, the G minor. So for example, he might be thinking, he's thinking in a linear context, but, C minor F7, he might be thinking of it as G minor F sharp diminished, as C minor F7, things like that, or more novel things, like thinking about the upper extensions. Like he might be thinking C minor F7 as B flat triad, B triad, like he might play B flat triad, B triad in the cadence to B flat. So you get comfort with hearing the upper extensions and the way that that harmony moves up above. You hear that in your mind, and then you can relate it back to the lower harmony.
And you said
the bass note.
Backing it with appropriate changes. Does he mean that then the band, getting them to change, adding a few more chords then into the bar?
Well, I'm not sure how he would have been supplied the bass function in this case if he was practicing by himself, but sure, I guess he would practice on the bandstand, or maybe he would just play along with a record and try out an idea, which is kind of the way people did things in those days. They, played their own thing over a record. So he may have done that. He may have had his own recording or someone else's recording where there was a little bit of space where he could play over it and tried out the idea.
Well, I want my audience to check out jonraney.com, and there's really a wealth of information. Particularly, I want to turn to, there's a Jimmy Raney book in progress, and it's a PDF that you had put together that I guess synthesizes your father's teachings based on Jimmy Raney's improvised line. Could you just talk about that document?
Yeah, I have to talk about it with a certain sense of regret that it's an unfinished work. It's sort of like what is that movie, Mr. Holland's Opus?
Right.
So what happened with that was that in 1984, and this was actually during the time that I was staying with him, he was trying to put all of his things down that he was teaching in lessons down to paper. And he had a manuscript, and it was in longhand, and he had pasted Xerox snippets of his own playing on the text. He was actually cobbling together this text. And it was about maybe, I want to say, 25 pages. And he sent it to Mel Bay, and Mel Bay unfortunately rejected it. And so at some point I decided, well, this thing really, there's a lot of gold here. We should try to do something. I can't
believe they rejected it.
Yeah, well, I guess it wasn't what they were looking for. They were expecting something more traditional, something more that they could understand better. They just didn't understand it, I don't think. So I basically tried to transcribe everything that was in there faithfully to a Word document. And I had, at the time, I guess I had maybe Sibelius or Finale. And so I'd create the musical examples, and I would actually paste it in a Word document. And over time, I actually played editor a little bit, and like when he made a grammatical mistake, or sometimes maybe he was, you know how that is when you're writing. I was being his editor, really. You're writing something and you think you said something, but you only thought you said something. So I started supplying things like missing thoughts, and then after a while, because it was only 25 pages, so you can imagine he did these on large manuscript with pasted in text and such, right? So it wasn't very long at all when you actually translated it to a Word document. So after that point, it was like, well, it's not quite long enough, and I don't think he truly finished. So I then started to come up with an idea for a sort of a mashup in a way of my appraisal of my father's playing plus the original book. And I mean, this was just on me, but I felt like when you're studying yourself and trying to come up with things to teach people, it can get a little technical. And I felt like some of the things that he was doing in his real playing, he was actually missing himself. I know that sounds a little bit...
Oh, what do you mean? Could you give an example of that?
Well, some of the things that I get into in the latter portion of the manuscript about his polyrhythms and how he was applying very sophisticated concepts that he really wasn't getting to in his book. I felt like there was, well, some of the things that I got into, I don't know if you read the recent blog about poly-metric grouping of bars,
I
where you're
did,
into
yeah, and that was really interesting.
grouping things in like 5 beats, 5 beats, 5 beats. He was doing these things and not getting into them enough, I suppose, and also just some of his isms. He has certain phrases of his that I felt like I actually did almost like an archaeological dig of his vocabulary and tried to codify them, and I had to actually listen to his entire output and then extract common phrases from them, but then actually then take apart, like, well, how did he use these particular pieces of his language? Like, I became a scholar. I had to become a scholar.
A musicologist, yeah.
Yeah, in order to do that. So that was my quest, to take that initial guide that he had developed and then augment that with actual demonstrated concepts in playing. Like, because I feel like when you're teaching something, you come up with technical examples, but when you actually play things, they're a little bit different. You're responding in a different way. You're responding more intuitively, more naturally, and the things that come out might have been things that he wasn't demonstrating in his book. So that was really it.
What's different about Jimmy Rainey's approach to improvising bebop than, I guess, compared to the typical way it's taught?
Well, I think his approach is really more, maybe it's not so much about idioms as much as music. I don't know how to describe that. When I listen to my father, I almost feel like his music, he's almost like in another world in a way. Like, I listen to some of those early recordings and it's almost like he's above them. He's apart from them. I don't mean it in a, like, trying to insult the other players, but his style is almost like, feels like it transcends idiom. And he talked about that a little bit when he was referring to Beethoven, for example, that there was a universality about his music that sort of transcended the time it was played at. And I think his playing transcends idiom in a way. So his approach, I believe, transcends idiom in a way. So I think that's what makes him different. He wasn't, like, I believe that some people can be groove players, for example. Like, they try to just kind of sit in the pocket and then play intelligently and in the pocket, and which of course he did. But it's his mind that's going on here. It's like what he's thinking about is a very complex individual. How he responds is exactly his life experience, like how he puts them in. Well, maybe other people are more about kind of laying in the pocket and trying to play good ideas. It's a little bit about that. And of course, all that's important. But I think what's different about him is the ideas are what make the time, not the other way around. I think the other players' approaches are more about hitting the pocket and making sure you've got cool ideas.
Here's a quote from that book, from the Jimmy Rainey book, and it says, "There is a lot of sequential stuff in my playing that's hidden sometimes. In other words, there will be sequences, but they're decorated or hidden. The structure of your playing comes from the cohesion from sequences and patterns, but you can't make them too obvious." So how does he hide his sequences?
Well, in that passage of the book, I believe there's a musical example. So an obvious sequence, I guess, would be da-ba-da-ba-da, da-ba-da-ba-da, da-ba-da-ba-da. It gets boring after a while, right? Too obvious. So what he would do would take an element of sequence, but it's a developed or varied sequence. So, for example, he quoted in that sample, let's say, ba ba do ba dee ba do ba do ba dee do dee da dee da da dee da da is the example, right? So, ba ba do ba dee da is the first idea, and then the second idea is ba ba do ba da do dee da dee da do dee da da. So you can see the relationship between them. You know, the da da dee da, the same notes are there, but he's applied it in a way that it's deceptive. You can hear a relationship between the ideas, but you don't do them in a way that's really boring. You do it in an asymmetrical way, or you extend the first idea was a 3/4 idea, and the second idea was maybe a 5/4 idea there. So you're breaking up 8/8 into 3 and 5, right? And the common theme between this da 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 and da 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 and da, right? So if they're both arpeggios, they both end with that da idea, but they're put together, and then together in themselves, that's the cohesion there. And that's also the interest, because it's not straight sequence.
One thing I found really curious about bebop is sometimes on the strong beats, you get very unusual notes. So sometimes you might get the sharp 9, the flat 9 on the strong beat. And so, I mean, if you're going from a classical perspective, if you have a dissonance, you have to resolve it or prepare it. But in the sense, now we're throwing in other things like polyrhythms, starting on different beats and different phrases that blend into different bars. Are there any rules that, like, for instance, I mean, sharp 9, flat 9, I mean, do you have certain things that, I mean, as a system, do you think there are things you shouldn't play? I mean, the lines don't sound quite right.
Well, for him, yeah, I guess he believed in asymmetry and dissonance and resolving them eventually. You know, anything that's just pure dissonance all the time, well, I mean, then you lose reference to what is consonant, right? So it's the dissonance is the beauty. Because it takes you on a journey and you have somewhere to come back to, which is home, you know, which is vanilla,
right?
Right? So you can't. I mean, isn't that a philosophical concept, the yin yang thing? You can't have dark without light and light without dark. And in music and composition, I even studied this a bit when I was studying composition in school, which is that you introduce dissonance, whether it's harmonic or harmonic rhythmic kinds of things. There is a scheme for development where you're moving away from home, and it's the moving away that creates the gravity back to where you started. So I would think that he thinks of dissonance in the same way. So, for instance, his sharp 9s or flat 9s, he tended to play certain sequences, like he would play flat 9, sharp 9 to the 5th, for example, or the 5th of the target harmony. In this case, if you're playing, let's say, C7, flat 9, sharp 9, he tended to go from the play flat 9, sharp 9, then resolve to C, which is the root of C or the 5th of F, depending on when the resolution took place.
There's another quote in the PDF, which is, a good line starts with an idea and builds from there, often using sequences, repeating the idea, starting on a different note and during a different chord, maybe also starting on a different beat, perhaps even an upbeat. And so that is my question. So if you're starting something on different beats and then your chords are kind of shifted, do you worry that you're kind of not gelling with the rhythm section in that sequence, or you're waiting for that ultimate resolution at the end of this? But what do you think of that blurring of harmony between the rhythm section and the soloist?
Well, that's the most challenging part, right? And that is, again, reflecting on back to what Parker was doing and what had such a profound impact on him. It's like Parker was doing those kinds of things. In fact, I believe I heard stories about where I think, what was it, Miles Davis talking about Duke Jordan, where, Bird was doing these crazy things with the beat, and and Duke was turning the beat around because he thought he was playing on the downbeat. And you know what I mean? So these things, you begin to hear these syncopations and rhythmic asymmetry in the context of what you're playing. You just hear it after a while. I mean, it's a challenge, as you say, like you risk getting lost. You know, if you start a phrase on the third beat and then resolve it in a weird place in the next bar, you would run the risk of losing one. But that is the way he thought about, and I believe the way Parker thought about harmonies. He thought the big picture. He wasn't thinking about the bar. He was thinking about how is he going to get from the first to the fifth bar or the ninth. And so the dissonance that he introduced, the harmony, he was dictating what the harmony was himself. He could hear what the chords were, but the given chords are just the roadmap that the rhythm section was given, right? What you do between point A and point B is of your own design, right? If you're generally within the ballpark of the harmony that's in people's sheet music, then you're fine. You just have to be able to hear the big picture.
I want to talk about your relationship with your dad and your brother. And so one quick question is, was he teaching you guys music? Did you learn music from him, or did you have your own teachers?
Well, I got started very late in music. It wasn't exactly encouraged or discouraged because I don't know if you've read some of the other things in the biography. My brother and my father left very tough lives. You know, they had a lot of issues, shall we say. And I guess my mom kind of wanted me to protect me from that. But when I went into college, I could barely play. So I started jazz playing in college, and then by the middle 80s, I lost my job and I went down and stayed with my father, and I woodshed on my own. And he would, give me advice about what to do and things. But honestly, I was deathly afraid of him, because he was so great that I didn't want him to hear all the crap that I was playing.
But what advice would he give you?
Well, I think I gave a little example of the advice he gave me at the very end of his biography pages. Like, I was playing something and I said, hey, man, what can I do to improve what I'm playing? And he listened to what I was playing, and then he said something to me that was complete nonsense. Like, it didn't have any logic to what he was saying. I said, what do you mean? And he said, exactly. So he really was a philosopher at heart. He's like, the Zen monk that hits you in the foot, when you're asking what's the meaning of life. It was kind of like that. It was a much more subtle but meaningful lesson he taught me, that you need to put cogent phrases together and make sense. That's what you need to do. It doesn't matter what it is, just put your thoughts together more coherently. And that is what you need to do. So that's one of the things he taught me. And I gigged with him a little bit there, but that was difficult as well because I didn't know any tunes, and it was tough,
And so where was your brother in all this when you were growing up? And you started post-college, and was he...
Right.
You played with him as well, but that was later in the 90s.
Yeah, my brother, like my father, he developed pretty quick and was an established player by the time he was 21. But he had already relocated to Denmark at that point. So he was actually married to a Danish citizen, and I hadn't seen my brother between he came briefly to do some recordings in 79, but after 1979, I didn't see him from 1979 till 1993.
Okay.
So that's a really
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
So I kind of developed my own world in parallel to him when then he decided to come back to New York. And then by that point, I was playing pretty well by 93. I was in a jam session band, and he came in and sat in, and so did my father. And then I went on tour with him in 94. And then he came back to New York in 96, 97, and 98. And we did gigs together. And the thing that's on YouTube is a recording of something we did in Birdland in 1996.
Your father and your brother recorded an album together. You said he learned quite quickly. What did your father think of his development and his playing?
My father's comment about my brother's development was, he knew he was talented, but one of the things he commented on was that Doug got better on each record, right? So he noted, like on his first record, I think it was introducing Doug Raney, like my father could hear some of the missed notes and things like that, like was maybe playing a wrong note here and there. And I guess my father was slightly more conservative. Like, for instance, there was a record where my brother sat in, and from 74, he's on an Al Haig record with my father and my brother, and or my father and my dad, I should say. I guess he would be 17 or so, 17, 18 at that point. And my father didn't want him to sit in on that record because he felt like he wasn't ready. And my brother did. So my brother was always, I guess my father felt like he was getting ahead of himself a little bit. He wanted to be professional before he was quite ready. He was more conservative. But my brother worked it out, and so by the time, in between, like, let's say 76, 77, and 79, he worked out everything he needed to work out, whether it was on the bandstand or on record. And a lot of people are quite influenced by those early records of my brother with Chet Baker, for example. I mean, he continued to develop, but so I think, my father was very proud of Doug, and he was aware that many people thought Doug sounded like him, but he knew the stylistic differences between himself and my brother. But my brother had a slightly different take on the Rainey language, so to speak, integrated with other influences as well.
I have an audience question, which is, what would your dad have thought about a song like Giant Steps?
Well, my brother purportedly, he was on the hunt. My brother was on a quest to find a recording of my father playing on Giant Steps. He insisted that it existed. Like, I had lots of old reel-to-reel tapes, but between moves and between all of us, they were lost. So my brother, my father definitely took in Giant Steps, and he actually said, his take on it was that Coltrane worked on it diligently. And the only way to get through a tune like Giant Steps is to really shed exactly what the concepts are on it. So that's, my father probably spent, a little time working on the concepts from Coltrane and then just kind of took it from there. So I think he liked it. I think he respected Coltrane, and he understood that what he was doing was new and a different appraisal of harmonic directions.
And did he ever meet Coltrane?
I don't believe he did, no. Coltrane was influenced by him.
Oh, yeah, talk about that.
Renee Thomas was in the scene, so, and he knew those guys. He knew. So if he said that, unless he's just trying to say something controversial, he's quoted as saying that, yes.
If somebody wanted to listen to the best, he's recorded so much, but what's a good introduction to Jimmy Raney? Which 3 albums should they check out?
Well, I believe that some of his most amazing playing is Live in Tokyo from 1976. That album, the one that Barry Harris quotes, where he sounded just like Yard.
Yeah.
That and the Strings and Swings album. I think it's on YouTube. There's 2 sides of it. The the jazz playing on that. And then his first record, I would say, which is Jimmy Raney Plays, which, I don't know, I mean, there's been a lot of re-releases and compilations, so it might be listed as under early Stan, perhaps, or some other recordings, different compilations. But he made 4 cuts off of Jimmy Raney Plays, and they're just amazing, modernistic type of tunes. Plus Round Midnight is on there as well.
There's a wonderful anecdote that you mentioned in your blog where I think it was John Scofield and Pat Metheny talking about your father recording, or rather playing Billy's Bounce on YouTube, and people can go and watch that. And they were very effusive in their praise of the recording. And so it just shows that he's really impressed and inspired many. Can you talk about some of the people that have been influenced by your father? And there are many, many big names. I mean, he really was a giant.
Well, the people that actually extracted his licks and things like that, that would be Renee Thomas, I believe, to a certain degree, maybe Grant Green. But who he influenced, certainly Jim Hall, because Jim Hall came after my father. And, Jim Hall is a great fan of his, and they were good friends. They hung out together and played some. And then, let's see. Well, Pat Metheny lists him as an influence, and John Scofield lists him as an influence. And
somebody said that Jimmy Raney was always a step ahead. Was it Tal Farlow who said that line?
Tal Farlow.
Yeah. I mean, Tal Farlow, what a giant and incredible player. And he said Jimmy Raney was always a step ahead of everyone.
No, I remember I met Tal at a gig of my father's at Gregory's, which was a club, like a local haunt in the Upper East Side. And they came in to check out my father. I think he was playing with Attila Zoller. And it was Tal Farlow and Sal Salvador came down. So they were just watching my dad, and they were just in awe, of what my father was doing. Because this was I guess it was the early 80s, and my father was just so on top of his game at that point. I mean, he was really, really something else. And people around knew. I mean, I remember seeing New Yorker articles like, hey, go check out Jimmy Raney. If you haven't heard him, you're missing something. I mean, he was really getting notoriety at that point.
Didn't he win the Downbeat Award one time?
He did. He won in 1954 and 55. And then one other time as artist deserving further recognition. I think that was later on, maybe 60s or something.
I have a question about another bebopper. Did your father have anything to say about Sonny Stitt, or meet him, or is there anything there?
I think he met Sonny Stitt in Chicago, actually, as I recall. And that's how he met this other sort of underground guitarist named Ronnie Singer, who played with Sonny Stitt. So the way, I mean, he thought Sonny Stitt was great. And, obviously he was a colleague, obviously, of Charlie Parker. And, there's a lot of different stories about how much he took from Parker and how much he developed simultaneously on his own by accident or things like that. He kind of, I feel like he changes the story a little bit. Maybe it's just a ego thing. I don't know. But I mean, things like that can happen if things are in the air, so to speak. That the same is said for Tal Farlow, my dad. People think that they influenced each other, but they didn't actually.
They came up around the same time, and your dad said they did it independently, right?
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Can I just mention a few more quick names? I'm just so fascinated by this. How about Oscar Peterson? Did they know each other?
I'm sure he met Oscar. I don't know that he knew him so well. I mean, he certainly respected Oscar. I mean, he felt more maybe enamored with Tatum than Oscar Peterson's playing to a degree, but he certainly recognized he was a tremendous player, for sure.
And Dizzy Gillespie?
Dizzy Gillespie, he knew him too. He's told me he played chess with Dizzy, and Dizzy crushed him in chess. My father was a good chess player too. So that just goes to show these guys' minds,
Oh, here's another name, Clifford Brown.
Clifford Brown. I don't think he knew Clifford, to be honest.
Very sadly, he died very young.
Yeah. He's kind of a different circle in a way, My father there's certain circles that musicians travel around in, and I don't think he obviously knew of him, and he loved his playing. He had kind of a sweet kind of sounding. And I think the way he described him, there's a prettiness about his sound, the way he worked out his particular version of bebop. I think it came out of Fats Navarro, really, Clifford Brown.
Now, your father is a master guitarist. I'm curious, did he ever, what did he have to say about other styles of music? I noticed classical music he was quite interested in. Was there anything else that might surprise people about what he listened to?
Well, he didn't like certain music, to be honest. He didn't really care for country music. He's actually been quoted and print that. He didn't like country music because he grew up around that, being in Louisville. He just didn't like it. But he liked classical music. He liked even some pop music. He's on record as saying he thought the Beatles were very clever and good, and he's glad that they came around. Even if it meant supplanting jazz for a degree, it was necessary. He thought that they...
Well, before them there was Elvis, so I wonder what he thought about Elvis.
Don't know. He liked Chicago. I thought he thought that they were interesting because they combined pop and jazz in a way.
What did he think about fusion when that started to come around?
I don't know. I think, the more probably didn't think so much of it because it was very chops oriented, and he was definitely anti-chops kind of person. He, his kind of thing was, well, what can you play in a ballad? Because his feeling was that, people can hide in the notes. Right.
Shredders.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, what do you have to, it's very impressive, but then when you reduce it to its elements, it's really a technical exercise. And all right, here's a ballad. What would you do on that? And they're stumped. They don't know what to play.
Oh, here's another name, Joe Pass. Did he ever interact with Joe Pass?
Joe Pass, I think he was really a fan of his solo guitar playing in particular. He had those records.
The virtuoso, yeah.
Solo guitar. So, he said some things that might have been a little, that are maybe known about Joe Pass's playing, are a little controversial. I don't even want to get into that, because then it gets into a bit of a turf war and, trying to saying things about other players, especially when they're alive or their fans are alive, it gets you into trouble, I think. I think you describe situations like that, where you learn something new and then you say it publicly, and then suddenly you've got internet trolls after you.
Sometimes it can be taken out of context too, and
exactly.
And history is full of that. Berlioz and Chopin. We could. I don't know if it's truly reflective of a relationship, just a quote out of context. So
yeah, people are people. They have opinions, and every once in a while they let them slip out, and they're quoted by somebody else, and then you have a situation, right?
Well, what can I say? The amazing Jon Raney, and he's done such a tremendous job to keep the fire for his father's legacy and his brother's legacy, both tremendous musicians. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about your father. And so, actually, I have a question. Are there things like tapes and things that need to be digitized that exist?
There might be a few things, but not. I think everything was recorded is pretty much out there. There might be bootleg things that people record live that I find out about. For instance, the concert that my father and Al Haig did in 1974 at Town Hall was released on YouTube. The recording is not great, but I think there's probably bootleg live things. But as far as studio stuff, I don't think there's anything worth noting.
Where can people go to? Yeah, you mentioned a forum. Are there places, avenues that Jimmy Rainey fans can interact with you?
Well, I mean, I guess that would be on Facebook, honestly. Some of the Facebook groups that are there. There's a Bebop saxophone blog, which sometimes I chime in on. There's a jazz pianist performance and jazz pianist teaching group in Facebook that I interact in. So there's definitely that. There used to be other forums that no longer exist, unfortunately, that I used to participate in. There was one from, I can't remember the name of it. It's something with jazz in the name. Names of things become foggy to me as I get older. But there was lots of forums that I used to participate in that are no longer exist, unfortunately. But those are the ones I participate in, the Facebook groups, things like that.
Well, everyone, check out jonraney.com. Everything you want to know about Jimmy Rainey. I think he's done a stellar job putting it together. There's a biography.
It's jimmyraney.com as well. They both point to the same place. So either way.
Good. jimmyraney.com, jonraney.com. The website has an extensive biography, transcriptions, music, interviews, teachings and writings, and letters, and so many things. Go to that website and please check out the music of Jimmy Rainey, and that the Rainey family is really a wonderful thing. Jon, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really hope we can come on again, and because there's lots more to talk about. So thanks a lot.
I look forward to that. Thank you very much.